Have you ever heard about Alexander the Great, the man who reshaped the world and left a legacy that still influences us today? But what if I told you that everything we know about him may not be the full story? This video uncovers the truth about Alexander the Great's sexuality. Was he bisexual? Did Alexander the Great's sexual orientation shape his legacy? But most importantly, does it even matter? Before we get into this topic, let's look at his background for context. Alexander was born in 356 BCE in Pella, the ancient capital of Macedonia. He was the son of King Philip II, a military genius who united the fragmented Greek states, and Queen Olympias, a woman with deep religious convictions and ties to the gods. From a young age, Alexander was steeped in the myths of gods and heroes. Raised by a fierce mother, it's said she believed him to be of divine descent, a belief Alexander would come to embrace. His education was equally extraordinary, as he was tutored by none other than the philosopher Aristotle himself. At the age of 20, Alexander unexpectedly found himself thrust into power when his father, Philip, was assassinated. Without hesitation, he took control of the Macedonian army and quickly quelled any rebellions in Greece. In mere months, he solidified his power and set his sights on expanding the empire. When we think of Alexander the Great, we often think of his incredible conquests, his military genius, and his legacy as one of the greatest leaders in history. But there's another aspect of Alexander's life that's often overlooked, and that's his sexuality. Specifically, the question of whether he was bisexual. It's a topic that's been hotly debated among historians and scholars, and today we're going to glimpse into the evidence and explore the possibility that Alexander's sexuality was more complex than we often give him credit for. Interpreting historical evidence about Alexander's relationships is a challenging task. The ancient sources we rely on were often biased, incomplete, or even intentional in their omissions. Additionally, the cultural norms of ancient Greece and Macedonia, where Alexander was from, were vastly different from our own, making it difficult to separate fact from speculation. Furthermore, it's essential to recognize that the boundaries between friendship, romance, and sexuality were often blurred in ancient Greece, making it even harder to pinpoint Alexander's exact orientation. Lastly, we need to keep in mind that many of the sources we have about Alexander's life were written centuries after his death, which means they may be filtered through the biases of later historians. The cultural norms of Alexander's time also played a significant role in shaping his relationships with women. He had multiple wives and mistresses throughout his life, including Roxana, a Persian princess from Bactria, whom he married after conquering the region. He later married Statira II and Parysatis II, both daughters of Persian kings, as part of his broader strategy to consolidate his rule over the Persian Empire. These marriages were likely political in nature, although they may have involved romantic or personal affection as well. Marriages like these were often political alliances meant to secure power and stability in his empire. However, some historians believe that Alexander may have had genuine emotional connections with some of these women, including Roxana, who was said to be his favorite wife. Historical context is crucial in understanding Alexander's relationships. He lived in a time when same-sex relationships between men were common, even among the ruling elite. In ancient Greece, men were often expected to have wives and children. However, it's important to note that the relationship between men in ancient Greece, especially among the Macedonian elite, did not always conform to the modern concept of being gay or bisexual. It was not unusual for men in this period to have relationships with both men and women, and these relationships often reflected political, social, or military alliances rather than purely sexual or romantic attraction as we might understand it today. It was also socially acceptable for them to have male lovers. This cultural norm is essential to understanding Alexander's relationships, particularly with his closest companion, Hephaestion. Hephaestion was more than just Alexander's right-hand man. He was his confidant, his partner in battle, and possibly his lover. They were often described as having a deep and intimate bond, with some ancient sources suggesting that they were lovers. Were they lovers or simply best friends? Alexander and Hephaestion grew up together and were extremely close, often seen as more than just friends. The bond between them was so strong that ancient sources described it as a soulmate relationship. One pivotal moment in Alexander's life that suggests his bisexuality is the story of his reaction to Hephaestion's death. When Hephaestion died in 324 BCE, Alexander is said to have been devastated, even mourning him with great public displays of grief, and then ordering the execution of the doctor who had treated him and holding elaborate funeral rites in his honor. The intensity of Alexander's grief was unparalleled, and it's difficult to find a similar reaction to the death of any of his wives or mistresses. In addition to Hephaestion, there are other pieces of evidence that suggest Alexander's bisexuality. For example, the ancient Greek historian Plutarch wrote that Alexander was infatuated with a young man named Bagoas, who was a slave and a eunuch. This relationship is significant because it shows that Alexander's same-sex desires weren't limited to just Hephaestion, but were a part of his overall sexual landscape. In the ancient Greek and Macedonian world, sexual relationships between men were not considered unusual or necessarily indicative of a particular sexual orientation. In fact, relationships between men were sometimes idealized, particularly in the context of mentorship or military camaraderie. It's also important to remember that Alexander was raised in a culture that didn't view sexual attraction the way modern Western society does. What does gay or bisexual mean in this context? Using the term gay to describe Alexander's sexuality is anachronistic. The concept of being gay or straight as fixed sexual identities only emerged much later, particularly in the 19th and 20th centuries. The debate about Alexander's sexual orientation is complex and multifaceted. While there is no definitive proof one way or the other, the evidence suggests that Alexander's sexuality was likely more fluid than we often give him credit for. His relationships with women, his political marriages, and the cultural context of his time all suggest a complex view of sexuality that doesn't easily fit into contemporary categories. Ultimately, Alexander the Great's personal life remains a topic of fascination and mystery, and we may never fully understand his feelings or motivations in the way that we can with people from more recent times. Alexander the Great died in Babylon on June 10th, 323 BC at the age of 32. The exact cause of his death remains a mystery and has been the subject of much speculation. Some theories suggest he may have succumbed to malaria, typhoid, or alcohol poisoning, while others propose assassination by one of his rivals. A more recent theory suggests he might have suffered from Guillain-Barré syndrome, GBS, a rare autoimmune disorder. So what do you think? Was Alexander the Great bisexual? And if he were, does it even matter? History is full of hidden stories like this. If you want to explore the ancient world, consider subscribing to join this community of history enthusiasts.